So what do Fate Testarossa, Vegeta, Boromir to a certain extent, I guess, Isla, and Dr. Watson have in common? Is it the ass-kicking? Well, I mean, yes, but that's not the answer I was looking for. What about the tendency to be overshadowed by the main character? Also true, but again, not exactly. Is it the fact that all of them are essentially descended from the same archetype of character from one of the first kinds of the story ever recorded by humans? Yes, that is the answer I was looking for. All of them in one way or another are Enkidu, the embodiment of the wild from the Epic of Gilgamesh. He's a super important character and idea, and I'm gonna tell you about him. Okay, so picture this. You're the gods, and a kingdom starts complaining that their king is a shitbag. So, in order to balance out his shitbagginess, you have to do something about it. So you spit on the ground, and you form clay out of it and make a guy. He's super strong, but he's also dumb as bricks. And he has no, human quality really to him except for the fact that he is basically human-shaped. He has no, real intelligence score. I'm not quite sure how that balances out the fact that there's a shitbag king somewhere, but anyway, you put him in the wild, and then you just sort of let him go hang out with herds of animals and shit. Perspective change. Now you are Gilgamesh, the aforementioned shitbag king. And a hunter comes to you one day, and he's like, hey, there's a guy out in the wilderness who is letting all the animals go out of our traps, and that's a bad thing, so what are you gonna do about it? And Gilgamesh goes, I got this. I'm gonna get the best prostitute, and I'm gonna send her out, and she'll take care of him. You know what's gonna happen. She's a prostitute. What's her job? 7 straight nights of boning. Boning and boning and boning. So now you are Enkidu, the guy made from clay that I talked about a minute ago, who has just finished banging this woman, Shamhat. And now you smell like her, and the animals don't really like you anymore because now you smell like people, so you can't go back with them anymore, so you go to Shamhat and you're like, And so she teaches you how to take baths and eat soup with a spoon. And bam, now you're civilized and humanly and such. Shamhat tells you about the dickbag king and you're like, yeah, okay, I got this. Thus educated, go to where Gilgashitbag is and challenge him to a wrestling match. Completely normal, right? You guys fight for days and days, and it's far too long of a fight to be interesting on screen, so they just sort of say, you fight for days. Finally, he beats you, and thus beaten, you become the literal best of friends. That's Enkidu's backstory, which is a lot better than a lot of the Marvel and DC Universe superhero characters, if you ask me. But anyway, so after you've beaten Gilgamesh, he becomes a not shitbag, and instead becomes, the actual good main character of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And then the two of you go off on all kinds of adventures, and you kill all kinds of terrifying monsters and big bads, and you do a bunch of important stuff with your bro. Enkidu is the world's first sidekick. I have the hiccups. So I know this episode is supposed to be about a deity of animals, which is why it's A-440 animals, but I sort of got sidetracked by how important Enkidu is literarily. The idea of the initially enemy beaten the hell out of, turned into friend, sidekick trope is fathered by this beast man. It's because of Enkidu that we have the entire idea of shows like, for instance, Magical Girl Lyrical Nanoha, or Tengen Toppa Gurren Lagann. I mean, think about it. For Nanoha, right? For instance, Nanoha's a normal girl who gets super magic powers and can call orbital lasers to completely destroy her enemies. And so she's a super badass. But in order to balance out the super badassedness, you have to have some other thing. So you've got Nanoha, who is like this beacon of brightness and goodness, who wears a white and blue costume. And then all of a sudden, a rival shows up who conveniently wears black and yellow, with the same or possibly greater amount of power, as Nanaher herself. There's a long series of fights, which parallels exactly the long fight that Gilgamesh and Enkidu had together, finally culminating in Nanoha besting Fate. Fate is the girl's name. Then they become literal, actual lesbians. Off-screen, of course, until it gets to Nanoha Strikers when they're a little bit older and it's less weird to portray them as such. Then again, Gilgamesh and Enkidu were also, according to some people's opinions, very homoerotic, which is fine, I guess. I mean, all that proves is that Enkidu is omnisexual, because Shamhat definitely was a woman, and he definitely boned the shit out. I'm getting sidetracked. Another character, like Captain America, for instance. Captain America is this little, like, bag of sinew, and then he gets supered up and becomes the, like, fastest, strongest, most upstanding, etc., etc. He's this, like, pinnacle of justice and goodness and all that sort of stuff, but then an equally strong, if perhaps differently powered, bad guy from Cold War era Russia, which is one of the two possible bad guys that we're allowed to have in movies now. He shows up, and then they have, like, rad awesome fights spanning 2 movies, and then they become best of friends. Technically, I mean, it could be said that Bucky was already his friend to begin with, and etc., etc. We're not going to deal with that bit. Bucky, the Buckmeister, and the Winter Soldier are 2 different characters, as far as this metaphor goes. They get to be friends and then they go on to beat up a bunch of big bads together, like Iron Man. By the way, how cool was that fight in Captain America Civil War? You and I both know that there's no way they could have beaten Iron Man. Iron Man would have finished beating the hell out of them and then been like, new suit, and a new suit would have flown in to get to him. They would never be able to beat Iron Man. But anyway, what about something like Buffy the Vampire Slayer? Buffy the Vampire Slayer is super rad, she's a thing, she fights people, she's super powerful, etc. And then some vampires show up, and so she fights them a lot, and then some of them become her friends, and then they go on and beat big bads. And it's the same pattern, again, in Sherlock Holmes. Watson is a doctor, and has, you know, been, like, a military doctor and has studied all of his life for this kind of junk. He's, like, actually really smart in his own right. But Holmes starts out being smarter than him, somehow. The first time they meet, for instance, a doctor and an arguably completely insane madman have this short little battle of wits where Sherlock, the smart one, says a bunch of stuff that Watson is like, there's no fucking way you could prove that you know these things. And then he does exactly that. So they come to an understanding of the fact that Holmes is way smarter, but they're still kind of cool. And so they become the best of friends and go on to beat up big bads. Romantic comedies. Romantic comedies. I hate this genre of movies so much. In this context, it also works. The 2 main characters of the romantic comedy, the guy and the girl, almost always start out as some kind of, like, antagonist to each other, or enemies, or bad guys, or some junk like that. And they have a movie-long worth of doing shitty things to each other and fighting and trying to, like, best the other one until at the end, they are lovers now for some inexplicable bullshit reason, because one of them defeats the other in something, and then they kiss, and then that's the end of it. And then the big bad, which was at that point the fact that the 2 of them couldn't be together, is defeated by these 2 people that were once enemies of some sort and are now friends. You cannot get away from it. It is so important of a character archetype, even taking away the fact that basically every sidekick character in Western media is a version of Enkidu. The narrower trope discussed here is present in almost every story ever. It's so important that it's literally a part of the hero's journey, which is the framework that pretty much every story uses. The hero's journey chart. Find it somewhere. Even better, though, is that Enkidu, as a character, shows up himself in a bunch of other places. Not just, like, a character derived from Enkidu, but, like, a version of Enkidu himself, actually shows up in several other places. Like, for instance, in Star Trek, there's an episode where Captain Jean-Luc Picard goes to a place, and the aliens' language is like a manner of storytelling and pageantry. They tell the story of these, you know, two people in their cultures past that fight each other and all that kind of thing. And so Picard, in an effort to, like, try to have meaningful conversation with these people, tells the story of Gilgamesh and Enkidu and how they get together. And it works, and it's amazing, because it's such a fundamental story. In Civ 3, if you play as the Sumerian people, and you choose Gilgamesh as your king, then your specialized unit, in most Civ games, each race has a special unit that only that race can get, and the Sumerians, when you play with Gilgamesh, their unit is called the Enkidu warrior. In Final Fantasy, Gilgamesh shows up as a character just a ton. They're almost always accompanied by another character named Enkidu. Sometimes he's a dog, or like some sort of beast kind of thing. Sometimes he's a guy. And it's also worth noting that you probably know a version of Enkidu's story that's different from the one that I told you just now. There are instances where, for instance, Shamhat isn't the best prostitute ever, and is instead like a musician, or is a priestess who isn't a prostitute, haha, let's be honest, but then has a load of wine or something like that. So depending on how tame of the story you know is, it just, there was like a huge resurgence in like the 80s and 90s to like make children's story versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, so that like children could be introduced to the concept of the Epic of Gilgamesh, because it's one of the most important pieces of literature that exists ever. Oh god, there is a spider on my ceiling. We're gonna leave it there and just keep an eye on it. There's a bunch of like kind of like neutered versions of the story that showed up in Western media to be able to like introduce it to kids. I keep looking up at this spider now. Oh, gross, fuck. But anyway, they're basically like the 4Kids versions of the story, and they leave out a lot of the juicy parts. They have finger guns instead of real guns. But getting back to like the actual theme of what this video is supposed to be, Enkidu is seen as the embodiment of the things that are wild. The idea of nature as an embodiment rather than nature as a place. He is born of the earth and not of flesh, which makes sense because the wild would not be born of the flesh of man. It would be born of itself. And he's raised by wild animals, which is, you know, one of the oldest iterations of the bit where we get the wild man trope story who, like, lives out in the wilderness and eats grass with the herds and drinks from the same watering holes and is a hermit and that kind of stuff. He has no knowledge of, like, how to speak human languages. It is from this time as a wild man that we get him being considered that deity of the animals, because like he helps the animals whenever they're like stuck in the traps. He communicates with them with ease, and was raised by them until he was at least adult-sized. Later on in the story, after he becomes converted, he even still is cool with the animals and like protects herds of sheep and cattle and that kind of stuff from the bigger, badder animals in a sort of weird reversal parallel thing. Where are you going, spider? Shit. Oh god, you're getting closer to my bed. That's the idea of like nature before it is influenced by man, and at that portion of history, the idea of like the okay, we're gonna have to fucking kill this spider, hang on. Okay, I managed to get it into a cup and threw it out of my window because I didn't want to kill it, because I know you're not supposed to and all. At that period in time, it was actually seen as a good thing for something that was savage to be then introduced to the idea of being civilized. You know, having humanity. You could look at it now as being, when, for instance, before he was all sexed up by Shamhat and didn't smell like people, he was able to hang out with the animals, and he had like a community where he was raised and that kind of stuff. But then as soon as he smelled like humans, all of that got ruined, which is a symbolism for the fact that humans ruin everything in nature. Whatever the case is, there's a lot of fucking involved. To make a long story short, you have good ol' Enkidu to thank for basically every sidekick in any story. he sure does a lot of work. I know I classified him as A-440, a deity of animals, but I really wish that he was officially, like, recognized as, like, a secular patron saint of literature. Wouldn't that be fun, having a series of, like, secular patron saints of stuff? Thanks for watching this episode of Deity Salad, you guys. I'm really happy to be able to get back to this series because it is one of my favorite ones to do, and it is because of my wonderful Patreon patron, Mikkel, that you guys got this video put together. I now have a grand total of 1 patron, which is awesome, because I didn't think I was going to get any of them. Thank you, Mikkel, for throwing your hat into the ring with me. If you are interested in continuing to see this kind of video go up, or indeed any of the other videos in the series that I'm working on, feel free to look at my Patreon, which I will put somewhere. I don't want to point anywhere. Consider, you know, being supportive there as well. If you like this video, please like it and subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends, because even that helps quite a lot. It lets me know that you guys do want to keep seeing this kind of thing. Thanks very much for watching, and I hope to see you again next time on whatever video I put up next.